This is the period of time where people travel, go on holidays, and the period where we normally have visitors here on the island. And last year and this year that is a bit more difficult than it was before. It's not so easy to travel from A to B, especially when you're not vaccinated. And you need to get tested, and the tests cannot be older than a certain amount of hours. And to be here, you also have to fill out a so-called PLF, personal locator form, and that cannot be younger than a certain amount of hours. And so you have to think of a lot of things, and actually until shortly before you travel, you're not certain whether everything will work out. So it's a challenge, and you can sort of compare these problems or challenges with what Paul had to face, the Apostle Paul. And I want to read today from 1 Thessalonians, where Paul speaks about these difficulties. And this letter, by the way, is the oldest writing that we have from Paul. So the order in which the letters are in the Bible is not the order in which they are written. We have the 4 Gospels, the Acts, and then we have all the letters, but they go from the largest or the longest until the shortest. So that's from Romans to Philemon. And that's the way they are ordered, but it's not the order in which they were written. 1 Thessalonians is actually the eldest of all Paul's letters that we have in our Bible. And before we get there, in Acts 13 verse 9, we can read that Paul was also called Saul, and or in Hebrew Shaul. And I've always wondered what's the deal with that. Why did he have another name? Is it like Jacob, who was called Israel, or Abram, who was called Abraham? These were changes that God made, but Paul and Saul is not something that God did. It was not that Paul changed his name. Actually, in those days, during the Roman occupation, it was not uncommon to have 2 names. A Hebrew name, if you were Hebrew obviously, Hebrew name, and also a Roman or Latin name. So the Hebrew name was Shaul, which means to ask for or to petition, and the Latin name was Paulus, which means small. And in Greek that is Pavlos. So he had both names, and they are very similar to keep things easy. Anyway, that's just a side note. The thing is that in Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki, as we say, there was a Jewish community, and Paul preached there on his second trip. And although he went to the synagogues and he preached to the Jews, there were more non-Jews that actually listened to him. And the Jews were not very pleased with his teaching about Jesus, because that would make Jesus a king higher than Caesar. And if they would proclaim that, if they would testify of that, they would get into serious trouble. So they didn't like all this teaching. As it says in the book of Acts, it was turning their world upside down. So they caused an uproar, and that is why Paul had to flee. And he later tried to return, but he couldn't. And that is why he wrote this letter, this first letter to the Thessalonians. And it was, of course, way before the time of emails and WhatsApp and Skype and what have you. And fortunately so, because of that, we have his writing today. Otherwise, it most likely would have been lost. He was worried about the Thessalonians, whether they had kept the faith. And that is an interesting thing to think about, that he was worried about this. Maybe you know the feeling and maybe not, but in both cases something to think about, that when you do not hear from a friend or from someone maybe you shared the gospel with, or you handed out a tract to or whatever, when you haven't heard of this person for a longer time, you might also be worried. What's going on? Is he or she maybe angry with me? Did I say something wrong? What's happening? That is actually a healthy worry to have. And so that was what was on Paul's heart. Now, why was it so hard for him to get back to Thessalonica? Was it far away? Well, if we look on the map, we see it's about 350 kilometers, not extremely far. Although in those days, of course, there were no highways and no planes, but still, compared to all the traveling that he had done, it was not extremely far. Did he have to cross borders into another country? No, he didn't. It was all inside of Greece, because he was in Athens himself at that time. Of course, he would have to cross some checkpoints, by the way, because there were different provinces inside the Roman Empire. So there were checkpoints, but it was not. It would normally not have been a big deal. It's not that he had to do PCR tests and health checks and go in quarantine and all this kind of things that we face today. So what stopped him? Or maybe we should say, who stopped him? So before we get there, let's first read what happened before that. And that we can find that in Acts 17. And I read the first 10 verses. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. There was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who, coming thither, went into the synagogue of the Jews. So it's interesting to see that Paul was not discouraged in his mission. He had to flee. He was actually helped to flee to Berea, and right away he went into the synagogue to do the same thing, to preach the gospel. And continue verse 13. But when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea, they came thither also, and stirred up the people. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea. But Silas and Timotheus abode there still. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. So from Thessalonica, Paul had to flee to Berea, and from there down to Athens. And that's where he still was where he wrote this letter to the Thessalonians. The Jews, we read here, they honored Caesar more than they honored God. They would rather obey the government in order to keep their position, to keep their status, their comfort, their peace. And these fellows, Paul and Silas, and those that were with him, they came to, as we read, turn their world upside down, and that they could not handle. Is this the same we face today? Is this why our lives are being made so difficult? Is it because of Christ and his gospel that turns the world upside down? Is it enforced by men that honor their position more than anything else, and who cannot tolerate another king? I think the answer to all these questions is yes. Now, what did Paul do now that he could not come to Thessalonica himself? We read that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 1. Wherefore, when we could not longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and sent Timotheus, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ. So he could no longer hold. He was so eager to find out how they were doing, since he could not come. Then he sent a brother. He didn't stop. He wasn't discouraged and demotivated to continue. He just found another way. And in all this, it's interesting that we see that Paul realized who the enemy is. And that is something that we often forget. Because if you read the thing that we just read from Acts 17, you would think of these Jews and these lewd fellows that they gathered. They are the enemy. They are the bad guys. But that's not the real enemy. And Paul understood that very well. If we back up in 1 Thessalonians to chapter 2, in verse 18, there Paul writes, Wherefore we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us. This is what he understands. It's Satan who is hindering. It's Satan who is the real enemy. And this is the exact same thing we face today. This is what it's all about. So, again, why did Paul want to be together with them? Why bother? There are other places he could go, and he did go. But why was he so eager to also be with them? Well, the answer is because they were brothers and sisters. In this letter, the first letter to the Thessalonians, at least in the King James translation, Paul calls the readers, the people in Thessalonica, 14 times brothers and sisters. And brethren must be together. They are meant to be together. And we are instructed to do so. In Hebrews 10 verse 25, this is commanded to us. Also, it's not only that we we must, but it's also pleasant. It's a blessing. This is what we read in Psalm 133 verse 1, that it is good and pleasant for brethren to dwell together. So he was hindered. What did he do? Well, we just read that he sent his brother Timotheus. The exact fact that Paul couldn't come, the reason that he couldn't come, proved the necessity that he had to come, or that they had to be together. This is the same today for us. The fact that we are prevented from gathering together proves the fact that we should be together. They were being persecuted. The enemy was giving them a hard time. And he does so too among us today. By hindering our gathering together, by separating us, and in that way he weakens us. It's very much like predators. They scare a flock of animals until the flock begins to run. And once they begin to run, the weaker one, the slower one, the sick one, the younger one, the one that cannot keep up with the rest of the group, will be separated. And that's the one that they will attack and devour. And this is exactly what happens. The weaker ones will be separated, and they will lose the faith. So getting together is not only pleasant, it's also essential. It's essential. And also this Paul makes very clear in 1 Thessalonians 3 in verse 2. He says about sending Timotheus, and then he says, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. So there was another reason. Of course, he wanted to meet them and to know how they were doing, but he also wanted to establish their faith, and he wanted to comfort them in their faith. And that is essential. That is essential. Paul was sending letters, but that was not enough. And same, we can meet, quote unquote, meet through Zoom or Skype or other means, but that's not enough. We cannot, and we should not be socially distanced. We should be socially gathered, and it's essential because in that way we can be established and comforted. For that we have to be face to face. A body cannot function when it is dismembered. It makes perfect sense. Anyone would agree with that. A body cannot function when it is dismembered. And an army cannot win a battle when the soldiers are sitting at home. It just doesn't work that way. But okay, maybe you will say, I'm established and comforted enough, I'm good. Well, the fact is you're not. There are things ahead that require that we prepare more, and as much as we can. So you would say, what is coming then? Well, Paul also clarifies that to the Thessalonians. He's not just making an empty statement. In verse 3 of chapter 3, he says, that no man should be moved by these afflictions, for yourselves know that we are appointed thereunto. Afflictions will come. We are appointed thereto, he says. You already know about them, but there will be more. And it's quite a thing to read that we are appointed to afflictions. And so you need preparation. When you have to make a long journey with your car, you fill up your tank. Otherwise, you won't make it. So we need to do that. We need to prepare more. Things will get much harder, and we cannot say that we didn't know. Also, this is something that Paul says in verse 4. For verily, when we were with you, we told you before that we should suffer tribulation, even as it came to pass, and you know. So he's saying, we told you before. And you've seen it. They had, of course, seen and experienced how Paul was being persecuted and not able to return. So they knew about this. And likewise, we know there are many verses in John 16, for example, in verse 33, Jesus says the very same thing. It reads there, these things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. In the world you shall have tribulation. It's not maybe, it is a given, it's a fact. This is what we should expect. And also later Paul writes the same thing to Timothy himself. He reminds him of this in 2 Timothy 3 verse 12. He says there, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. He uses the same words Jesus uses. They shall suffer persecution. It is a fact. It is going to happen. You better prepare yourself. And so we must get together. Lockdown or not, vacation or not, holidays, we must get together. And we should have an urge also, like Paul, to find each other. To do whatever we can to get together. To make sure that we are all good with regards to the faith. And of course to comfort and establish one another. In verse 5 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul then continues and says, "For this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you, and our labor be in vain." He had preached there, he had planted the church there, and he says it's very possible that the tempter, that's the enemy, that is Satan himself, the same one that was hindering Paul, that he was in the meantime also destroying their faith, and then all their labor would have been in vain. It were not the Jews that were the enemy. They were, or at least a part of them, were just people that Satan used. Just as he uses people today to hinder the church from gathering. And so that he can tempt whoever he can and destroy the faith. This epistle that Paul writes is not just an epistle to the people in the Thessalonica. It's a letter to the church of all times. It is relevant very much for us today. And Paul makes us also clear in the ending of this letter, in chapter 5 verse 27, he says, "I charge you by the Lord that this epistle be read unto all the holy brethren." I charge you, there is an urgency and it's important. It has to be done. And then he says, to all the holy brethren, all. He makes no distinction. This pertains to all, and thus also to us. Therefore, let us not forsake to assemble ourselves together, even more as we see the day approaching. Amen.